Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, during this trial, the prosecution has presented an ample amount of evidence to demonstrate the fact that the defendant is guilty of arson. You have seen the evidence and heard the testimony. You have been shown how the acts of the defendant apply to Arizona Revised Statute Section 13-1703, which defines arson in our state. I do not wish to review those facts in this closing argument. Instead, I would like to talk about the history of arson and why it is a particularly heinous crime in our system of justice. I would like to talk about why the crime of arson deserves to be punished and what those punishments are. Arson is a malicious and intentional crime that puts human life at risk. Even if the intent is not to kill directly, the possibility of killing is well known to the arsonist and is disregarded, and possibly desired. Arson has ancient roots as a property crime, but it is much more than that. It is a crime that threatens the basic human need for habitation. It was considered to be a felony in common law, just as it is today. In common law, it was defined as the malicious burning of the dwelling of another. Under Old English common law, the penalty for arson was death. It was punishable by death, just like murder, because the consequences are usually the same. Arson is a deliberate and malicious act. It threatens property. It threatens human life. Arson is a threat to public safety and security. All of these are reasons that arson is a crime. We can remember the Happy Landing Social Club in New York back in 1990. It is an example of how devastating the crime of arson can be. In that case, an angry ex-boyfriend with $1 worth of gasoline set fire to a nightclub that resulted in the death of 87 people. It also resulted in $5 billion in lawsuits being filed, settling for much less, obviously. Arson is the leading cause of fires in the U.S. In 2019, there were 33,000 arsons reported in the United States. Each one had an average cost of $16,000. That equals over $500 million in damages caused by arson. That following year, the U.S. Fire Administration reported 3,790 fire-related deaths in the U.S., with a good percentage of those being related to arson. That, ladies and gentlemen, is why arson is a crime. So, I ask you, what would an appropriate punishment for a crime like this be? As I previously mentioned, arson was traditionally treated as a felony, and it still is. In our state, the arson of an occupied structure is defined in Arizona Revised Statute, Section 13-1704. It is a Class II felony. A Class II felony in Arizona has a presumptive sentence of 5 years, with a maximum sentence of 10. In this case, there was no evidence that the building that was burned by the defendant was occupied, nor did we try to prove that the defendant believed it was occupied. So the defendant was only charged with a Class IV felony, arson of a structure or property. A Class IV felony has a presumptive sentence of 2.5 years. That is the crime the defendant is facing today. Our community is very lucky that it was not much worse. We are all very lucky that there was no injury and no loss of life. However, you have seen how easily that might not have been the case. You can see how the defendant disregarded the possibility that his actions could have resulted in an innocent's death. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I implore you to consider the gravity of the crime of arson and how it threatens the sense of safety in society. Even though there was only property loss this time, some of the items were cherished possessions. Those items are irreplaceable, as was the sense of security that the property owners had. Even though the defendant deserves much worse, you can at least hold him accountable to the full extent of the law. So let us stand together in the pursuit of justice, and let anyone who would consider the crime of arson in our society know that it will not be tolerated. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to deliver a verdict that will give our community the justice it deserves, and find the defendant guilty of arson. Thank you.